to start out with one that is called Clever Rachel. Now, this is a story that's about a king, and he's a very, very proud king. He's very clever in his wits, and he's a good-looking fellow to boot. But he vows that he will only marry a woman as clever as he is. And so, of course, he's single at the time we're talking about now. And one day he goes into an inn with his retinue is with him, and he listens to the innkeeper. He overhears him bragging about his daughter Rachel and how clever she is and how she's the cleverest woman in the whole kingdom. And he can't stand this kind of bragging. And so he calls the innkeeper over and he said, "You know who I am? I am the king of this country." And when the innkeeper sees that it is the king, the king, he's afraid. And he said, "Oh, sire, welcome to my inn." But the king says, "I don't like braggers. Now, I want you to go to your daughter Rachel and give her 3 riddles that I will tell you right now. And if she can solve them, well, I'll give you a reward. But if she can't solve them, you'll lose your inn." The innkeeper was so worried. But the king went ahead anyway, and he said, "Well, the first thing, what is the fastest thing?" he said. "What is the richest thing? And what is the dearest thing? Now go home and ask Rachel those questions." And the innkeeper said, "Rachel will never be able to answer these questions." He certainly wasn't able to answer them. But as soon as he went to Rachel, she said, "Father, don't worry. You won't lose your inn. Just go and tell the king that the fastest thing is thought, the richest thing is life-giving earth, and the dearest thing is love." And the next day, well, the innkeeper went back to the king, and when the king heard those answers, he said to himself, "I have always vowed to marry a clever woman. Could it possibly be that Rachel is the cleverest person in the whole kingdom? But she's only a commoner, and I'm a king. I'll have to know more." So he said, "I want you to go home to Rachel and have her come here in 3 days. But she must come neither walking nor riding. She must come neither dressed nor undressed. And she must come bearing a gift that is not a gift." Oh, the innkeeper was his usual worried self. How on earth could he possibly get Rachel to answer those questions? But as soon as he went home and told Rachel, she said, "Father, don't worry, but you must go out and buy me something. You must get me a fishnet, you must buy me a goat, and you must buy me 2 doves. And so he had no idea why, but he went out and bought all those things. And on the 3rd day, Rachel came out and she wrapped herself in the fishnet. And then she sat on the goat so that she was half on the goat and her leg was dragging on the ground. And she said, "Father, hand me the doves." And he did, and she held on to them by their feet. And then she went to the palace, and she went right into the courtyard, and she called for the king, and she said, "Oh, sire, I am Rachel, the innkeeper's daughter. As you can see, I'm half on and half off this goat, so I'm half riding and half walking. And I'm dressed in this fishnet, so I'm not really dressed nor undressed." And the king started to smile. And he said, "Yes, and the gift that is not a gift?" And she held out the doves to him, and he said, "Oh, yes. Here, sire, for you." And as soon as he tried to grab a hold of the doves, they flew away right out the window. It was truly a gift that was not a gift. And the king laughed and laughed, and he said, "Oh, Rachel, you are indeed the cleverest woman I have ever met." Now, Rachel was very good-looking, and she was very clever. And the king, when he was not being pompous and all kingly, he was very kind and generous, and he was also very good-looking. They looked at each other once, and they liked what they saw. And they looked at each other twice, and he totally forgot that she was a commoner and he was a king. And they looked at each other 3 times, and they fell in love. And he said, "Oh, Rachel, will you marry me?" And she said, "Of course I will." "But," said the king, all at once he remembered that he was a king. He was of royal blood, and she was only a commoner. He said, he said, well, you must never interfere with one of my royal decrees. And she sighed and said, all right, I won't. And the king and Rachel were married, and they lived together for many, many years, very happily. And then one day, she was walking past his court, and she saw an old man standing in the door of the court. And he was leaning up against the wall, and he was sobbing. He was all in poor clothes. He was a peasant, obviously. And he was sobbing as though his heart would break. And she went up to him and she said, my dear sir, what's the matter? He said, oh, I have nothing. I have nothing of my own but a mare. And the mare gave birth to a foal underneath my neighbor's wagon. And now the king has said that the foal belongs to my neighbor. And Rachel said, oh, that's the silliest thing I've ever heard. That's ridiculous. Here, I'll tell you what to do. She got that clever look in her eyes, and she said, go and get a fishing pole and go back and pretend you're fishing in the window right here underneath where the king's window is on the marble floor. Just go and get one. So he came back with his fishing pole, and he threw the line out, and he reeled it back in, and he threw the line out, and he reeled it back in, and he really got into what he was doing as though he were catching fish, and all around him were laughing and tittering at him. And finally somebody told the king. And the king looked out of his window and he said, my good sir, how could you expect to catch fish on a marble floor? And the peasant answered exactly as Rachel had told him to answer and said, why, sire, I could as good catch fish on a marble floor as a wagon could give birth to a colt. He saw red at that point. His face got red, his eyes got red, and if there were steam to come out of his ears, they would. He was so mad. Oh, he knew that there was only one person in the whole country that could possibly have an answer like that, and it was Rachel. He called her before him, and he sat on his kingly throne, and he said, Rachel, you have disobeyed me, and you have broken your promise. You have interfered with one of my royal decrees. Now you must leave the palace forever. Rachel just stood there. And he felt it already in his heart because he really loved her. He didn't want her to go, but his pride took over completely. He said, listen, you may take your dearest possession, but then you must go. And she still stood there. She wasn't afraid at all. She said, sire, before I go and leave your presence forever, may I have another cup of tea with you, a final cup? And he said, all right. And so, of course, she made the tea, and she poured a little sleeping potion into the cup, his cup. And she presented it to him and drank her own tea, and he just had a few sips before he passed out on the rug, fast asleep. And she rolled up that rug with the king still inside. And then she put it up on her shoulders like this, and she walked right out through the palace gates. Well, the guards saw her go, but they knew that she could take something special with her, and so they just let her go. And in the morning, when the king woke up, he was lying on his own carpet, but he was outdoors. And there was a bee buzzing by his nose, and he brushed it away, and then he saw Rachel. And he said, Rachel, what am I doing here? And she said, well, sire, you told me to leave the palace, and you said I may take my dearest possession with me. And that, my dear, is you. And at that point, the king forgot his kingly royal blood forever. And he just looked at Rachel and he said, oh, Rachel, I've been a fool. Please come back to the palace with me. And she said, well, I will, but will you let me give you a little bit of advice every once in a while? And he said, why, of course. Come, my dearest possession, let's go home. And that's the story of Rachel the Clever.